With over 500 magic spells across all of the Souls games, there are countless videos and tier lists made ranking these spells over the years. And although this content provides great advice on what you should or shouldn't use, I haven't seen many videos which rank something objective such as damage. So today, we will be ranking the DPS of every spell from lowest to highest, starting with Dark Souls 1. Despite having the worst DPS and the second worst single cast damage, this spell still finds its use in clearing out basic enemies, as it has 30 uses and a fast casting speed, and although it can kill early game bosses as the spell is easy to use, it is still weaker and slower than most the spells you can acquire around the start of the game, and although it finds itself on the lowest spot on the list, it is definitely not the worst overall and serves its purpose well as the starting spell for the sorcery class. Oh boy, where do I even begin with this spell? I guess we'll start with the positives, in that this spell doesn't require faith or intelligence, it can hit multiple enemies, and lastly, it is one of the coolest looking spells in the game. So now you must be thinking, how does this spell have the second worst DPS in the game? And this is because this spell is the only AoE attack that can completely miss at point blank range consistently. Okay fine, that's unfair to test it on one skeleton. Let's see what happens when we use it on the thickest boss in the game. And that's not even the worst of it, as this spell can never hit the same enemy more than once, meaning if you successfully manage to use this thing despite it taking 5 business days to cast with no hyper armor, it is still a coin flip between one sword hitting or doing absolutely nothing. My favorite part about this spell is that they decided to name it Gravelord Sword Dance because the boss will be dancing with joy after seeing you decided to use one attunement slot for this piece of garbage. I still have more to say about this spell, but luckily, From Software knew how much we would like it and decided to make an upgraded version. Oh boy, I sure hope they increased the damage. I guess I was asking for too much, as this spell is just as garbage. What I find most interesting is that this spell mimics the attack Nito uses, but his spell tracks the player perfectly, and also applies toxic. Not only does both these miracles not track, they also don't apply the status effect. My theory is the real Nito died long before the events of Dark Souls 1 and a random skeleton found his corpse and decided to wear his skin in order to start a covenant in his name, so he can sell a course and live out the rest of the Age of Fire in a penthouse in Lordran. Ah yes, the classic sacrificing of casting speed for more damage. There is not much to say about this spell, other than it does more DPS than regular Solaro, which makes it slightly better at killing bosses than you may think. However, by the time you get this spell you will be able to also get its direct upgrade. But hey, at least you now have 2 spells dedicated to trash mobs. Dark Orb is basically a cooler looking and slightly more damaging version of Heavy Solaro, but with some key differences. Firstly, Dark Orb does more damage even when using the starting catalyst, which has no dexterity or strength scaling. This is worth mentioning as the Dark Sorcerers scale with those attributes, but only if you choose to use a catalyst which scales with strength and or dexterity. This spell also has a bigger hitbox, so don't bother using it indoors, as the spell will likely get caught on a random surface. But despite Dark Orb having less uses, a slightly higher intelligence requirement, and being harder to acquire than Heavy Solaro, it is still the better spell based on utility and being viable throughout all of New Game and even New Game Plus. The better version of Solaro, which is probably the most used sorcery throughout all 3 Dark Souls games, and this is mainly due to it being easy to use, as it has a fast cast which allows you to keep your distance better. But unlike regular Solaro, you will actually be doing respectable damage which can carry you until mid-game. This paired with the fact that spells in Dark Souls 1 don't consume any stamina creates the perfect recipe for ignoring the game's mechanics. And at the end of the day, isn't that what being a spellcaster is all about? Ah yes, finally, the last Solaro. Everything I said about heavy Solaro applies here, but you guessed it, this one does more damage. Absolutely crazy, I know, but something important we can learn from these sorcerers is that the lecturers at the Vinheim Dragon School are scamming its students by teaching them the same spell 4 times. This is probably the reason Big Hat Logan decided to invent the Soul Spear and Homing Soulmass, as he was bored of the same basic projectile. Let me just say this first. I always thought this spell was cool, and that was before I realized it can do damage, as this ranged AoE bomb can handle both trash mobs and bosses, and because of the large explosion, you even have the ability to play unlocked at closer ranges, so there is even some skill expression in using this spell, which is always a nice welcome. However, this miracle does share the exact same DPS as Great Heavy Solaro. But since Emit Force can hit multiple targets and is way better than that sorcery slop, it is getting the high ranking. Oh boy, after 5 sorceries and 3 miracles, we finally have the starting pyromancy spell. With that being said, it is an all-rounder, being able to damage more than one enemy as long as they are grouped up, but that's not all, as this spell is capable of melting mid-game bosses for some reason. Oh, and in case you forgot, pyromancies only scale with the pyromancy flame, so you don't need faith or intelligence whatsoever. The only downside this spell has is in its range, as it is noticeably worse than the other spell types, so you have to be more mindful of your position. But other than that, it is clear which of the spell types got the most love in this game. The classic lightning spear, and the first of the 3 lightning miracles in the game, which all unfortunately share the same stupid slow cast speed as Heavy Solaro, or at least that is what I originally thought, as I actually found that lightning spear has an even slower cast speed than Heavy Solaro. As you can see on screen, both spells are cast at the same time, and while the Solaro materializes first, the lightning spear actually hits the skeleton before the Solaro does, and this is because the speed of the lightning projectile is much faster. This is even more noticeable at longer ranges, which is where you will be most the time as a magic user in the first place. And not only does this spell outdamage Great Heavy Solaro on raw DPS, lightning is also the better damage type in Dark Souls, so the damage gap will seem even larger throughout most the game. Oh, would you look at that? The spell with the highest intelligence requirement doesn't even crack the top half of the list. Truly a Souls classic. But in all seriousness, this spell is still pretty good, as it acts as a Solaro that travels on the ground piercing through enemies. But unfortunately, we are not playing Peak Souls 2, so this ability won't see much use outside of clearing out trash mobs. But due to having 20 casts and respectable DPS, you can kill Seath with his own spell, giving the founder of sorceries a taste of his own medicine. This spell serves as the direct upgrade for Lightning Spear, dealing more damage but with the same slow cast speed. The problem with this miracle is obtaining it, requiring either online play or farming bugs underground. The fact you've got to max out a covenant to get your second lightning miracle is crazy, and this should do more damage to compensate for that. Personally, I would just give every miracle more casts, which will make up for the extremely low amount of offensive options in the game. Nevertheless, this spell is still definitely worth getting as a miracle caster. Fire Orb is the first upgrade from the starting pyromancy, in which it shares the same cast speed and range but deals more damage and has a larger hitbox. This makes it a better early game boss killer, but also for taking out weaker enemies, as the AoE can now catch more enemies in one cast. The larger hitbox can also allow you to free cast easier at close ranges since you have a lower chance of missing. Overall, this spell will be a great upgrade until some pyromancies you'll see later on in this list become available. But the funniest part is that if this spell did lightning damage, it would have a higher DPS than the lightning miracles you can obtain without entering New Game Plus. The last of the lightning miracles, Sunlight Spear, has the highest damage but with the disadvantage of having half the casts compared to the rest. And honestly, why? You can't even get this spell without going into New Game Plus. So since most people aren't going to use this thing, why not just give it crazy high numbers? And if not that, at least have it be obtainable in the regular new game. It's not like Gwyn uses it in the boss fight anyway, so it would be cool if you could fight him with his own spell. Overall, I don't want to rip into this spell too much because if we look at the Souls games, the final boss rewards have historically been weak, and it is definitely not the worst spell or weapon to come from a final boss. So out of respect, I'll be returning this spell to the rightful owner, who can clearly use this spell better than us. Catch Flame from Elden Ring was so good they had to add it to Dark Souls, and although this version can't jump or roll attack, spells don't consume stamina in this game, so it serves as a great R1 spamming option for casters. Due to the speed of this spell and the many casts you can acquire, it can feel better to use than the high damaging options, especially for taking out trash mobs. This spell is definitely a necessity if you prefer to play at a faster pace and engage with the game's mechanics, as you would do with a strength or dexterity build. Great Fireball is the upgrade to Fire Orb and still follows the same trend of having increased damage with a larger AoE while keeping the cast speed and range the same. It has the joint highest damage on first impact out of all the fireball spells, and with the increased hitbox you may as well be throwing the sun at the enemy. This spell performs great against bosses that move frequently since the damage is completely front-loaded, unlike Great Chaos Fireball which has the same initial hit but leaves a damaging after effect. This is worth mentioning since both this spell and Great Chaos Fireball only have 4 casts each, so it is good to use these two spells together. Firstly, this spell should be called Fire Snake, as the speed of this spell is way too slow to be used as a whip, and it sounds a lot cooler. But besides that, it is a very unique spell which can hit the same enemy twice, making it great for trash mobs as well as for larger bosses. Due to the slow speed of this spell, you can also use this spell unlocked, which makes it easier to use at closer ranges, as you won't need to fight the camera as much. Overall, it is a fun spell to use, but definitely not the best, as if you don't hit with the spell twice, the DPS will be much lower, and at that point, you are better off using Great Fireball. Homing Soulmass is a high damaging spell which procures multiple soul arrows above your character. These arrows will stay floating there for over a minute and will only fire the homing projectiles if you are in range of an enemy and your character is facing them. This spell works best when leading off the boss fight by casting it outside the fog gate, like you would do with any external buffs. The issues only start when you try to use this spell during the boss fight, as the spell can sometimes miss if the boss leaps or moves sideways. This can happen since the speed of the projectile doesn't give the homing mechanic much time to correct its course. The second issue is that the number of orbs you can cast is dependent on your intelligence level, so keep in mind the damage will be a lot lower than what I've calculated if you're only meeting the minimum requirements for this spell. The weakest of its type, Firestorm works by summoning several fire pillars around the player, dealing high amounts of damage, and unlike the Gravelord miracles, this spell can hit the same enemy multiple times, making it great for dealing high burst damage to bosses. And although this spell is good, it does come with some problems. Firstly, I found that this spell can only hit at a maximum of 3 times on the same enemy, and by enemy I mean Seath and the Gaping Dragon, which both have giant hitboxes, so good luck trying to hit smaller bosses with this spell. Secondly, this spell takes 5 seconds to fully cast, meaning you will probably be trading out with bosses a lot of the time. So unless you're going for a one-shot with RTS, make sure you have enough health so you don't get destroyed while casting this thing. But besides that, I actually value this spell a lot despite there being 2 upgrades in the late game, and that is because this spell works better against bigger and slower bosses, and those bosses are found more in the earlier parts of the game. So if you enjoy one-shotting weak bosses, this is the spell for you. The classic Soul Spear. I love how this spell completely invalidates 90% of the spells covered in this list already. But in all seriousness, this spell is just simply better, having the same cast speed as the soul arrows and a higher damage than the heavy soul arrows. Oh, and it also pierces through targets, just in case it wasn't good enough already. The only weakness of this spell is the low number of casts, but since you can get a copy later in the game, you don't need to worry about that for long. And for the cherry on top, there's still another upgrade to this spell. Truly a Dark Souls 1 sorcery classic. The direct upgrade from Combustion. This spell increases the damage and the AoE of the flame, making it more effective for bosses as well as taking out trash mobs. However, since this spell can only be acquired once, versus regular Combustion which has more casts and can be acquired twice, Combustion is still more valuable for getting through the game. An interesting detail about this spell is that in the in-game description, it is said that sorcerers mock the simplicity of this spell. Well, I can see where the frustration is coming from, as I would be annoyed if my great soul arrow was doing less than half the DPS of a flame being cast by a homeless man with no faith or intelligence to his name. The last and strongest of the fireballs, Great Chaos Fireball, shares the same values as the last version with the added bonus of leaving behind a pool of magma after the fireball hits the enemy. This temporary magma can hit multiple times, granted the enemy or boss stays in the same location. This makes the spell stronger for dealing with trash mobs as well as larger and more immobile bosses. However, if you aim too high from the ground, the magma will not appear for some reason. So if you want to get the most out of this spell, try and lock onto the boss's lower hit points, or just free cast and aim at the floor so you can reliably activate the magma. But the main reason I'm going to value this spell is that you can acquire this spell after killing just 2 bosses, and that's with counting the Asylum Demon, and the fact that you get this spell just for joining the Chaos Covenant is genuinely insane. Just look at the other spells you get for joining a covenant. Why on earth is this reward so much better? Starting off the top 10 with Wrath of the Gods, this spell has the highest DPS out of all the miracles and one of the best spells in the game, as it literally has everything. It has a fast cast speed and an instant cast, making it the best panic spell in the game. It has respectable damage per cast, similar to Great Lightning Spear. It hits in a medium range 360 AoE, so it's the best spell for crowd control and for playing unlocked against bosses. The only real weakness of this miracle is that you only have 3 uses per playthrough, and that's usually not enough to kill most bosses. Of course, they had to sabotage the only top tier damaging miracle in the game. The only pyromancy found in the DLC, Black Flame, is the last of the Combustion pyromancies, dealing more damage and also looking way cooler. But that's not all, because for some reason, this spell does crazy amounts of stamina damage. Just look what it's doing to Super Smo. Bro can't even do anything. On top of all that, it seems to deal some physical damage like the dark sorceries, but since pyromancies don't scale with any stats, I'm unsure where the damage comes from. So if you have any idea, please let me know in the comments. Overall, this would definitely be the best pyromancy in the game if Dark Souls 1 had the MP system, as this spell can kill the bosses that are immune to fire damage, so you wouldn't need any other spell to beat the game. The direct upgrade to Homing Soulmass. The crystal version does considerably more damage, dealing the second most DPS out of all the pure sorceries in the game. But there is not much else to add to what I said about Homing Soulmass, other than the fact you should bench that version and use the crystal one instead. At number 7, we have the highest DPS out of all the pure sorceries, which is Crystal Soul Spear, and just like Homing Crystal Soulmass, the only change to this spell is that it does more damage, but since Soul Spear is so versatile and easy to use, the damage increase is going to feel much better than on Homing Soulmass, which is typically going to be used fewer times during the boss fight. Because of this, Crystal Soul Spear is one of the most comfortable sorceries not just in this game but also for the rest of the Dark Souls trilogy, and although I'm not counting external buffs, Crystal Soul Spear with a full sorcery boosting build will result in the highest long-range DPS in the game. At number 6, we have Fire Tempest, which is one of 2 upgrades to Firestorm. This spell shares all the similarities of Firestorm, except the damage in that the fire pillars are much larger, and while this is typical for all the pyromancies, it is particularly better here as this spell is already very RNG dependent, so by making the pillars larger, it will be easier for this spell to hit 3 times. Another fact worth noting about this spell is that out of all the Firestorm spells, the pillars on Fire Tempest have the highest damage, despite the spell not having the highest overall DPS, and because of this, many people might prefer this version, as the damage is more front-loaded. This means you will get more success with this spell against the more mobile or smaller bosses in the game that don't stand in one place for too long. Starting off the top 5, we have Chaos Fire Whip, which produces a slow-moving stream of fire, just like regular Fire Whip but with a magma after effect. This spell shares the same logic as Great Chaos Fireball, because if you aim this too high, the magma will not appear on the ground, so free casting this spell while aiming down will allow you to trigger the magma effect consistently. This might make it the hardest to use spell in the game, as regular Fire Whip is already weird to use due to how slow the Fire Whip travels. Overall, you will see the most success with this spell against immobile bosses that will sit around long enough for the magma to hit multiple times. The final Firestorm variant, Chaos Storm, behaves just like Great Chaos Fireball and Chaos Fire Whip, as each pillar produces a magma after effect, which means more overall damage, but for some reason this spell has a downside, in that the actual pillars itself hit for less damage than Fire Tempest, so for this spell to get the maximum amount of damage you will have to use this thing against the larger bosses such as Seath, Nito, and the Gaping Dragon, so outside of the fat bosses in the game, this spell is unlikely to land all its damage consistently. Starting off the top 3, we have Pursuers, which acts like the dark version of Homing Soulmass, but with some key differences. Firstly, this spell is much slower, and while this would be bad for most spells, it is actually better because the slow speed gives the homing mechanic more time to correct its course if the boss leaps or moves fast. Secondly, the amount of orbs that you cast doesn't rely on your intelligence level, which means this spell will also be much better than Homing Crystal Soulmass at lower investment. And lastly, this spell scales off your physical damaging stats, so staffs that scale with dexterity and strength will have the spell do even more damage. However, since this spell and the Mana's Catalyst both require the same boss soul, you won't be able to get the full build until New Game Plus. Coming in with the second highest DPS in the game, yet the lowest single cast damage, we have Fire Surge. This pyromancy acts like a flamethrower in that the initial cast takes some time to travel, but after that point you have a constant stream of fire which can shred any boss as long as you don't get interrupted, and since spells don't consume stamina, you can keep casting without worrying about having low stamina to dodge or panic roll. The main issue with this spell is more of a universal issue with Dark Souls 1, which is the fact you have no poise whatsoever, so if the boss happens to breathe in your general direction, you best believe your shit is going to get interrupted, which will lower your damage output significantly. This means that Fire Surge is great for bosses that leave big openings between attacks, as well as bosses that you can't stand under while casting. Finally, we are at number 1, the spell with the highest DPS in the game, and the spell she told you not to worry about. We have Dark Bead. I'm not going to bother playing devil's advocate and say this spell has limitations as the DPS is so high it doesn't even matter. This is one of the examples in fiction where something is so overpowered it doesn't matter what the opponent does because they will be dead before they can do anything meaningful. All I want to know is how did this not get nerfed? Please let me know in the comments since I never played this game until the remaster. I guess it's worth mentioning that this spell isn't great against Manus since he obviously has dark defense, but more importantly he directly influences the story in Dark Souls 2, and we, as in me and you, all know that game is the undisputed GOAT, so it only makes sense the Dark Souls 2 representative is resist to the best spell in the game. And there we have it, every Dark Souls spell ranked by DPS. If you are interested or have skipped to the end, here is the final list. This section of the video will be an overview of the findings which will be used to compare to the later Souls games so we can see how magic changes throughout the series. Firstly, by finding the average DPS of each spell type we can see that the pyromancies are the most damaging spell type in the game, closely followed by the sorceries and then not so closely followed by the miracles. This was surprising as not even Darkbead and Pursuers could carry the sorceries to have the highest damage, but since many of the starting sorceries are at the bottom of the list, while the pyromancies have almost no spells in that area, it makes sense that pyromancies have the highest average DPS. Secondly, we need to remove miracles from the statement that magic is broken in the earlier Souls titles because not only do the miracles have much lower damage, there are only 7 of them and one is not even obtainable in regular new game. But if we look at the list, the DPS progression is actually pretty balanced in this game as many of the early game spells sit near the bottom of the list, and as you progress through the game you will gain access to higher damaging spells, though a big reason why this is the case is that most of the spells are just straight up better versions of the last one you had, so a big part of this is a lack of variety, especially with the sorceries. Anyways, that's going to be the end of the video. If you enjoyed this ranking and want to see this for the next game which is Dark Souls 2, please let me know in the comments and I'll see you in the next one.